Around a little bit because we're going to talk about the guns before I load and fire this weapon. Let you know when to get back for when it's safe. So I welcome you all aboard the USS Constellation. We are the last all-sail wooden warship built by the U.S. Navy back in 1854. In 1855, the ship is commissioned in the Navy, and that's where we get all the guns down below on the gun deck. Breaking down the number of guns, we had 4 32-pound long guns. Those were our chase weapons. They would have been located right down below us at the bow and right outside captain's cabin. Now those guns, by the time the Civil War breaks down in 1861, are antiquated weapons. They can fire a nice solid 32-pound piece of solid cast iron cannonball. It can come through the side of an enemy ship. It would make a nice round hole. But the carpenter, who usually has a block or a plug, can fit it right into the shell hole, can fit it into the hole the round made. The ship could make their way to port where more further restorations and repairs can be made. In 1855, when the ship is commissioned, the ship is given its main battery of guns. And those guns are 8-inch chambered shell guns, and they fire explosive shell. So you think of a large bowling ball filled with black powder with a fuse at the top. When fired from the gun, give it about 10 or 12 seconds of flight time. Once it hit the side of the enemy ship's hull, it would then explode. Gunners could also time their shells to go through the inside of the enemy ship and then explode, causing even more damage. Now if you look over at our lightship Chesapeake over there, or a submarine Torsk, that's about the maximum distance we would want to hit an enemy ship at. We want our targets to be in close. Those guns down below on the gun deck do have a range of 1.5 miles. We are not fighting battles at that range. We want our targets to be in close to where we can do the most damage. Pier 1 over here, where you see our new business center being built, that's actually a better target because it's much more closer. And when firing those shell guns, we're actually skipping and bouncing them across the water to make sure we're hitting the water line of the enemy warship, the area of the ship where the water meets, where the ship's hull meets the water. I have a 50% chance of hitting the 423 on sail of the Torsk over there with one of our shell guns, even though it's that close. By making the shell bounce and skip across the water, I have 311 feet I can hit. 5 well-aimed shots will sink the ship. In 1859, though, Constellation made flagship of the U.S. African Squadron, which means we're going after slave ships. What it means to be a flagship is the officer in charge of the squadron of ships on the U.S. African Squadron flew his flag here from Constellation. So that's what made Constellation the flagship. And that's where we get these. That's where we get our rifle guns. So up here you see our 20-pound Parrot Rifle. It would have been actually located back at the stern. And up here, mounted on a brass rail system, you can actually see what an image of it would look like over there on our wayside. Would have been a 30-pound Parrot Rifle mounted on a brass rail system, as I said. The reason it's mounted on a brass rail system rather than a wooden truck carriage like this is you could traverse the gun or aim the gun 360 degrees in any direction which an enemy force might be coming from. In theory, you could also fire it down the length of the deck. Probably wouldn't want to do that because you would have high rate of casualty among the ship's crew. That's why it was a theory. But the big difference between these guns and the guns down below on the gun deck is that inside this barrel, there are lands and grooves which allow the round to spin. And the rounds being fired from this gun look similar to a modern-day bullet rather than a round cannonball. The Baltimore Sugar Factory sign over there is 1.25 miles away. If I was to turn this gun, load it with a charge of powder, put the 20-pound projectile into it, I can hit the D of that sign 95% of the time. That's how accurate this gun is. And it's perfect for going after slave ships. Because when you go after a slave ship, you're not aiming for the hull of the vessel. That's where all the captives are. You want to aim for anything above, for the mast, for the rigging. If you look up, anything above you, to immobilize that ship. Once that slave ship is demobilized, the prize crew made up of U.S. Marines and sailors would be rowed across in one of the Constellation's small boats and take charge of the ship. The crew of that slave ship would be rounded up, thrown to the brig or jail of their own vessel, located all the way down the hold. And the captives are released upon deck of the ship they're already on. And Constellation would be very, very successful and perform a great job as flagship of the African Squadron. She would capture 3 slave ships personally. The Galicia and the Triton would not have any captains aboard them, but had all the decking prepared to take on captives. But in September of 1860, Constellation would stop and capture the slave ship Cora, with over 720 people in the hold of that ship. Constellation, because she is flagship, gets credit for 14 ships captured, over 4,000 freed. The most successful time that the U.S. African Squadron was actually active. When the Civil War breaks out, Mr. Lincoln recalls all the ships of the U.S. Navy because of the bigger issue of the Civil War. Constellation at that point is then sent to the Mediterranean for 3.5 years of the war, where she would act as a deterrent to Confederate privateers, raiders, protecting Union merchant shipping, but also she would act as a diplomatic ship, showing the flag to European powers to keep them out of the war, or siding to keep them out of the war, especially if they were debating siding with the Confederacy. A typical crew for this gun would have been 5 to 6 men and 1 boy. Down below on the gun deck, that number was 14 men and 1 boy. The reason we had young boys on this ship was to help run the powder and the shot to the gunners working the gun. You go down below on the gun deck, and if you imagine all those guns with all the lines splayed out and the implements lowered, when we're down there doing gun drill or giving tours, we're sometimes even as interpreters are smacking our heads up against those rammers, or you might trip on the lines. But young boys are perfect for this job, ages 12 to 17. Actually young, they could be as young as 11 years old. They would be nimble enough to run between the lines. They were small enough that they'd be able to duck around the implements hanging to run powder and shot, as I said, to the gunners working the guns. That's just the brief overview of the guns on this ship. Now I'm going to go through the process of how you would work one of these guns, how you would load and fire it. So the first implement I have right here, I've been holding the entire time, this is called a worm. It's a brass push right here. I'm going to run it down the barrel of the gun to clean out any debris that might be inside it. When I first did this program 3 years ago, I wormed the charge from the previous day's firing from the gun. Also, one of my coworkers 3 years ago actually wormed a toy car out of this very gun that someone put in the muzzle before the firing. So you always have to make sure it's clear because anything inside can become a projectile.
Rascals. Or if that's like those Daredevil cars.
So nothing. Also, the reason the worm, and later on when I bring out my pick to pick the charge, to put a hole in the charge, is made of brass. Brass and iron does not spark. Iron on iron will spark. We want all the sparks to occur outside the ship, not inside the ship.
It's there.
So my next step, and the most actually critical step of firing a Civil War artillery piece, whether it's on ship or the field artillery, is I'm going to take my sponge staff here. It looks like a giant Q-tip. I just dumped it in my sponge bucket over there. And I'm going to run that again like the worm, run it inside the barrel to finish cleaning it out. After this gun would be fired, the remains of the powder charge would still be burning back here in the breech of the gun. Put fresh black powder on top of burning embers, what do you think is going to happen? Ooh, exactly, it's going to prematurely explode. Stuff like this did happen during the Civil War. At the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, America's bloodiest day of combat in the Civil War and bloodiest day in history, there was a gun crew that was not sponging their guns because they wanted to have a high rate of fire down on advancing enemy infantry. The number 2 man, whose job was to put the ammunition in the muzzle of the gun, had his hands blown off when the round exploded at the muzzle. Another gun, they were in the process of charging a round into the breech of the gun. When, according to one of the battery members, the gun went off and sent the rammer whizzing over towards the enemy. That gun did not have a second sponge, and remember that September day in 1862. So case in point, you always sponge the gun. Makes it even more deadly than here on the ship. So just like the worm, I'm going to send it down. Pull it out.
Did they put like water in it?
Yes.
Dry or wet?
I was wet. Because I put it in the sponge bucket right there.
Oh, I missed it.
Yep. If you watch me when I clean the gun after the firing, I'll be doing the same sort of thing. Because sometimes before you could dry sponge the gun, but sometimes you want to wet it just a little just to clean any gunk out that might still be inside. Because you would always, for the field artillery when working these guns, you would always go through the worming process, clean out, just make sure the gun's clean before service. And you may have to worm it usually after every charge because you're removing the remains of the powder bag as well. I'm going to want to leave this up.
Those things from sponges. I thought it was just pushing the shit in. Yeah.
Right here, this is my powder charge. This is 4 ounces of tightly compact black powder. Back in the day, this gun would have taken a 2.5 pound charge or a 2 pound charge sometimes. And the powder bag would have been made of wool or flannel or linen, something cheap. We use tinfoil today because tinfoil is relatively cheap. Also, because we are in downtown Baltimore, so close, we're only allowed to fire 4 ounces. Last time this gun fired full amount of powder, should the windows of the Hyatt Regency right behind you. And they asked us politely not to do that again. But on holidays like 4th of July, New Year's Eve, we're allowed to fire what is called a moderate charge, which is a little more powder than our usual. Also, because of the reason we're in downtown Baltimore, I'm not loading in the 20-pound projectile. Turning over right there is a very good Irish pub. And they haven't fired on me, I don't want to fire on them. Also, the shell will go through their front windows, actually blast their front windows completely out. Go through the rest of the building, go into the Renaissance Hotel, and then just keep flying into downtown Baltimore. So, no projectile today. No projectile today, but you do get a boom. So I'm going to just steep the charge in the muzzle of the gun, and taking my rammer, I'm actually going to charge the round into the breech of the gun. Now the gun is actually loaded, but can we fire it in its current state?
No.
Obviously not, because we risk doing damage to the ship. Now shipyards have been very busy, especially for the year and a half we were closed during the pandemic. So I ran the gun back in, now I have to run the gun out. This is the audience participation part of the program. If you would like to step up and help me run out a 19th century piece of naval artillery, please step up to the outboard side lines on either side of the gun. If you step up over on this side, more line will come out. You step up on the outboard side of the line. More people can jump on the line if they want. Okay, so there are a couple more, so more line will come out on that side. There are a couple of commands. When I give the command action, we're going to bend down. And then when I give the command action in the hull, we're going to stand up. Just make sure your feet are firmly planted on the deck. Because people have a tendency to want to back up. The idea is to keep your feet firmly planted so that it's one fluid movement. So, action, haul, action, haul, action, haul. One more, action, haul. That does well, drop your lines. Thank you to my gun crew. So the next step is I'm going to take my brass priming pick right here, and I'm going to send it down the hole on the vent of the gun right here. Underneath the vent is where the charge is. By making a nice hole inside where the charge is, I will then insert when the suppression primer is then inserted, that will actually fire the gun. while ago get my hearing protection on. My colleague here will explain to you the role of the friction primer.
So this is the primer. It is a brass tube filled with gunpowder topped with a substance called fulminate of mercury. It's a highly volatile version of mercury. Connected to that with wax is a brass pin. When I pull that pin, or when he pulls that pin, the fulminate of mercury is going to break down and spark. Those sparks are going to travel down the tube that is filled with gunpowder, down into the hole we just made, and give us our boom. I am going to have to ask you all to get behind this first mast. Reason being is these shoot 50 feet in the air. We can get hit with them. We don't like you guys get hit with them. It does not feel pleasant. So you need to. Yep, behind this first mast, we have found them as high as our fighting tops. We have found them on the pier, and actually I did a firing where it landed next to somebody sitting next to our bell.
Stand in front.
You'll love this.
No, not you. We have a short lady behind us. I was giving her
Smart.
room.
You're standing behind the mast. Attention on the pier! Constellation is getting ready to fire! Stop the alarm!
Okay, so the last few commands. I'm going to take my lanyard right here. And pull, I'm going to take my lanyard. That will actually fire the gun. Feel free to cover your ears with the palm of your hands. And that'll be done on the command, make ready.
Here we go.
Make ready! And there you go. So that's what 20-pound Parrot Rifle sounds like back in the day. Thank you all for joining me this beautiful day here on the USS Constellation.
It blew out the windows in the hotel.
And our other ships here on the historic ship from Baltimore. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome. If you have any questions about the guns, feel free to ask me.
28 ounces? Yeah. That's a